think there are roughly 3 things going on now that are going to profoundly change the world very quickly. And when I say very quickly, the cycle is roughly a new model every year to 18 months. The first is basically this question of context window. And for non-technical people, the context window is the prompt that you ask. So, study John F. Kennedy or something.
Right.
But in fact, that context window can have 1 million words in it. And this year, people are inventing a context window that is infinitely long. And this is very important because it means that you can take the answer from the system and feed it in and ask it another question. So I want a recipe. Let's say I want a recipe to make a drug or something. So I say, what's the first step? And it says, buy these materials. So then you say, okay, I bought these materials. Now what's my next step? And then it says, buy a mixing pan. And then the next step is, how long do I mix it for? You see, it's a recipe. That's called chain of thought reasoning. And it generalizes really well. We should be able, in 5 years, for example, to be able to produce 1,000-step recipes to solve really important problems in science, in medicine, in material science, climate change, that sort of thing. That's the first one. Second one is agents. And an agent can be understood as a large language model that knows something new or has learned something. So an example would be read all of chemistry, learn something about chemistry, have a bunch of hypotheses about chemistry, run some tests in a lab about chemistry, and then add that to your agent. These agents are going to be really powerful, and it's reasonable to expect that agents will be, not only will there be a lot of them, and I mean millions, but they'll be like the equivalent of GitHub for agents. There'll be lots and lots of agents running around and available to you. And the third one, which to me is the most profound, which is already beginning to happen, is text to action. And what that is write me a piece of software to do something, right? You just say it. I mean, can you imagine having programmers that actually do what you say you want? And it does it 24 hours a day. And strangely, these systems are good at writing code such as language like Python. You put all that together, and you've got infinite context window, the ability for agents, and then the ability to do this programming. Now, this is very interesting. What then happens? There's a lot of questions here, and now we get into the questions of science fiction. I'm sure the 3 things I've named are happening because that work is happening now. But at some point, these systems will get powerful enough that you'll be able to take the agents and they'll start to work together, right? So your agent and my agent and her agent and his agent will all combine to solve a new problem. At some point, people believe that these agents will develop their own language. And that's the point when we don't understand what we're doing. You know what we should do? Pull the plug. Literally unplug the computer. So it's really a problem when agents start to communicate in ways and doing things that we as humans do not understand. That's the limit, in my view.
And you think again, how far off in the future is that?
Well, there have been many, many predictions. Clearly, agents and these things will occur in the next few years. And it won't occur in there won't be one day where everybody says, oh my God.
Right.
It's more a question of capabilities every month, every 6 months, and so forth. A reasonable expectation is we'll be in this new world within 5 years.
Wow.
Not 10. And the reason is there's so much money. And there are also so many ways in which people are trying to accomplish this. You have the big guys, there are 3 large so-called frontier models, right. But you have a very large number of players who are programming at one level lower, at much lower cost, who are iterating very quickly. Right. Plus you have a great deal of research. I think there's every reason to think that some version of what I'm saying will occur within 5 years and maybe sooner.
Wow, now, so you say pull the plug. So 2 questions. So how do you pull the plug? But even before you pull the plug, if you know you're already in chain of thought reasoning and you're headed to what you fear, don't you need to regulate at some point that it doesn't get there? Or is that beyond the scope of regulation?
Well, a group of us have been working very closely with the governments in the West, and we've started talking to the Chinese, which of course is complicated and takes time, about these issues. And at the moment, the governments, with the exception of Europe, which is always kind of slightly confused, have been doing the right thing, which is they've set up trust and safety institutes. They're beginning to learn how to measure things and check things. And the right approach is for the governments to watch us and make sure we don't get confused on what the goal is, right? So as long as the companies are well-run Western companies with shareholders and lawsuits and all that, we'll be fine. There's a great deal of concern in these Western companies about liability, doing bad things. Nobody wants to hurt people. They're not. They don't wake up in the morning saying, let's hurt somebody.
Right.
Now, of course, there's the proliferation problem.
Yeah.
But in terms of the core research, the researchers are trying to be honest.
Okay, so that's the West. So by saying the West, you're implying that proliferation outside the West is where the danger is. The bad guys are out there somewhere.
Well, one of the things that we know, and it's always useful to remind the techno-optimists in my world, there are evil people and they will use your tools to hurt people. All technology is dual use. All of these inventions can be misused. And it's important for the inventors to be honest with that. So in open source, which is, for those of you who don't follow it, open source is where the source code in models, the weights, that is the numbers that have been calculated, are released to the public. Those immediately go throughout the world. And who do they go to? They go to China, of course. They go to Russia. They go to Iran, right? They go to Belarus. They go to North Korea. When I was most recently in China, essentially all of the work I saw started with open source models from the West, which were then amplified. There are regulatory solutions to that, but the important point is that that cat is out of the bag, or whatever metaphor you want. It's important that these more powerful systems, especially as they get closer to general intelligence, have some limits on proliferation. And that problem's not yet solved yet.
Okay, let's go to China. So you just, on Kissinger's last trip to China, you went with him, and he had a discussion with Xi Jinping on exactly this set of issues. Your idea was to set up a high-level group to discuss the potential and catastrophic possibilities of AI. Where do the Chinese fit in on this? On the one hand, I've heard you say, and not only you, that we need to go all out to compete with the Chinese for some of the reasons you just said, because there could be bad players or bad intentions. But where is it appropriate to cooperate and why?
Well, first place, the Chinese should be pretty worried about generative AI. And the reason is that they don't have free speech. And so what do you do when the system generates something that's not permitted in their country? Right? Who do you jail? Right? The computer, the user, the developer, the training data. It's not at all obvious. And the Chinese regulators so far have been relatively intelligent about this, but it's obvious if you think about it that the spread of these things will be highly restricted in China because it fundamentally addresses their information monopoly. That makes sense. I think the Chinese conversations are largely very constrained by concerns about bio threats and cyber threats. It's going to be very difficult to get any actual treaties with China. What I'm engaged with is called a Track 2 dialogue, which means that it's informal. It's educational, it's interesting. It's very hard to predict by the time we get to real negotiations between the US and China what the political situation will be, what the threat situation would be. A simple requirement would be that if you're going to do training for something that's completely new, you have to tell the other side that you're doing it. So that you don't surprise them.
So it's like the open skies during the Cold War.
So an example would be a no surprises rule. When a missile is launched anywhere in the world, all the countries acknowledge that they know it's coming. That way they don't jump to a conclusion and think it's targeted at them. That strikes me as a basic rule, right? Furthermore, that if you're doing powerful training, There needs to be some agreements around safety. In biology, there's a broadly accepted set of layers, BSL 1 to 4, right, for biosafety containment, which makes perfect sense because these things are dangerous.
Right. Are they moving as exponentially as we are in the West with the billions going into generative AI? Is China have a commensurate billions coming in from government or companies?
It's not at the same level in China for reasons I don't fully understand. My estimate, having now reviewed it at some length, is that they're about 2 years behind. 2 years is not very much, by the way, but they're definitely behind. There are at least 4 companies that are attempting to do large-scale model training, which is similar to what I've been talking about. And they're the obvious big tech companies in China.
Right.
They're hobbled because they don't have access to the very best hardware, which is restricted from export by the Trump and now Biden administrations. Those restrictions are likely to get tougher, not easier. And so as the NVIDIA and their competitor chips go up in value, China will be struggling to stay relevant, right? Because their stuff won't move at the same. Chinese have...
You agree with not letting those chips flow
Well,
to China?
The chips are important because they enable this kind of learning. It's always possible to do it with slower chips. You just need more of them. And so it's effectively a cost tax for Chinese development. That's the way to think about it. And is it ultimately dispositive? Does it mean that China can't get there? No, but it makes it harder and means that it takes them longer to do so. I'm much more concerned about the proliferation of open source. And the reason is, and I'm sure the Chinese would have the same concern. So again, these are the kinds of things that we'll be talking to them about, is do you understand that these things can be misused against your government as well as ours?
Right.
So the scenario is open source folks basically do something called basically guardrails. And they fine tune and they use a technology called RLHF to eliminate some of the bad answers. There's plenty of evidence that it's relatively easy if I gave you all of the weights, all of the stuff, so forth, it'd be relatively easy for you to back them out and see the raw power of the model. And that's a great concern. That problem's not been solved yet.
Reverse engineering. Basically.
Yeah, reverse engineering, and that's not been solved yet.